Segment 1. Before Sumer, the world before civilization, pre-4500 BC, southern Mesopotamia, the region situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is widely recognized as a cradle of early civilization. Yet, before the rise of the Sumerians, this landscape was very different. Prior to 4500 BCE, southern Mesopotamia was primarily a place of small, scattered human communities, each adapting to a challenging environment with limited resources. This segment explores the conditions and ways of life that preceded the development of cities, formal administration, and complex social institutions. The physical environment shaped human activity from the beginning. The land is a flat alluvial plain formed by millennia of river deposits. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow through this plain, but their behavior was irregular and difficult to predict. Floods could be destructive one season and insufficient the next, making agricultural success uncertain. The soil was fertile where irrigated, but water management required skill and cooperation. Natural resources were scarce. Unlike mountainous or forested regions, southern Mesopotamia lacked easily accessible stone, timber, and metal ores. Early inhabitants relied on mud, reeds, and clay for building materials. Stone tools were often imported from distant locations. These environmental factors placed constraints on the size and complexity of early settlements. Human occupation in the region during this period was characterized by small farming communities. These groups practiced what archaeologists call rain-fed or dry farming, supplemented occasionally by simple irrigation methods using shallow channels and basins. The primary crops were barley and wheat, which were well suited to the region's climate. Alongside farming, communities raised domesticated animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle. These animals provided meat, milk, hides, and wool. Housing was modest, typically constructed from sun-dried mud bricks and woven reeds. Settlements consisted of clusters of such dwellings arranged without formal planning. Archaeological evidence suggests that the size of these villages rarely exceeded a few hundred individuals. These groups were often kin-based and socially egalitarian, with little evidence for social stratification or centralized leadership. Social organization was relatively simple. Decisions were made communally or by informal leaders, but no permanent administrative or political institutions have been identified from this period. Religion, where it existed, was closely tied to everyday life and local natural features, but lacked formalized temples or priesthoods. There was no evidence of writing, monumental architecture, or large-scale labor projects. The economy was primarily subsistence-based. Surplus production was limited, and trade was localized. Barter systems predominated, and specialization of labor was minimal. Most individuals participated in multiple economic activities, including farming, herding, tool-making, and food preparation. The absence of significant surpluses meant that no class of specialists could be supported solely by the labor of others. Despite these limitations, these communities developed a range of technologies and social practices adapted to their environment. Tools made from stone, bone, and early copper were used for farming and craft production. Pottery was common and increasingly sophisticated, allowing for improved storage and transport of food and water. Fishing and hunting supplemented agricultural production, particularly in marshy areas. The unpredictable flooding of the rivers was a persistent challenge. When floods were too high, fields could be washed away, homes damaged, and food supplies destroyed. When floods were insufficient, irrigation failed, and crops suffered. This environmental variability placed natural limits on population growth and social complexity. By 4500 BCE, however, the situation began to shift. Population density increased, leading to the expansion of settlements and the formation of networks between them. Groups began cooperating on larger-scale water management projects, including canals and embankments designed to control and distribute river water. These early irrigation efforts allowed for more reliable crop yields and the potential for surplus production. The increase in surplus food had several consequences. It enabled some individuals to specialize in tasks other than farming, such as crafting tools, pottery, or textiles. It also supported the emergence of leadership roles responsible for organizing labor and managing resources. While no formal political structures existed yet, these roles marked the beginnings of social differentiation. Communities became more interconnected through trade and exchange networks that extended beyond the immediate region. Materials such as obsidian, copper, and shells, which were not locally available, have been found in archaeological sites, indicating long-distance contacts. These exchanges contributed to cultural and technological diffusion. Despite these developments, early settlements remained relatively small and village-like. There was no clear evidence of cities or large political states. Social hierarchies were incipient but not fully formed. Leadership was situational and task-oriented rather than institutionalized. In this period, religion remained closely linked to everyday life. Ritual practices likely focused on controlling natural forces, ensuring agricultural fertility, and protecting the community. While no monumental temples have been discovered from this era, archaeological findings suggest communal spaces for ritual activities. These pre-urban communities laid the groundwork for what would later become the Sumerian civilization. They developed the necessary social and economic mechanisms to manage shared risks and resources in a challenging environment. The innovations in water control, labor organization, and surplus production established a foundation for the later rise of cities and state institutions. The transition from these early farming villages to complex urban societies was gradual. It occurred over several centuries as populations grew, technological capabilities expanded, and social organization became more hierarchical. Civilization, therefore, did not emerge suddenly but as a response to environmental pressures, demographic changes, and increasing social complexity. This segment emphasizes that the origins of civilization in southern Mesopotamia lie in these formative centuries before 4500 BCE. The communities of this period were not yet civilized by later standards, but were essential precursors. They represent the initial adaptations that enabled humans to live successfully in this challenging landscape. By understanding this pre-civilized world, the viewer gains insight into the conditions and problems that Sumerian civilization later addressed. The irregular rivers, scarce resources, and fragile social structures created challenges that demanded new forms of cooperation and management. These early people set humanity on a path toward urbanism, centralized authority, and cultural complexity. In conclusion, southern Mesopotamia before 4500 BCE was a mosaic of small, largely autonomous farming communities living under environmental constraints. Their survival depended on flexible social arrangements, technological innovation, and emerging networks of cooperation. These factors combined over time to create the conditions necessary for the eventual rise of one of the world's first civilizations. Southern Mesopotamia, the region framed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is often called the cradle of civilization. This designation is not accidental. The geography of this area fundamentally shaped the trajectory of human societies living there, especially beginning around 4500 BCE. The physical environment presented distinct challenges and opportunities, which directly influenced the organization, cooperation, and social complexity of the communities that would eventually become the Sumerian civilization. The core geographical feature of the region is its alluvial plain, a vast flat area created over millennia by sediment deposits from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These rivers flow parallel through the landscape before converging near the Persian Gulf. Their waters sustain life, but were unpredictable in flow and intensity. The seasonal flooding cycle was irregular. Some years brought substantial floods, while others saw much lower water levels. This variability meant that agriculture, the primary means of subsistence, was inherently uncertain. Floodwaters carried fertile silt, which replenished the soil's nutrients, but they also posed risks. High floods could wash away crops, damage homes, and disrupt settlements. In contrast, low water levels could cause drought conditions, undermining crop growth. The flatness of the land allowed flood waters to spread widely but made the entire area vulnerable. Moreover, the rivers often changed course, which could alter access to water and fertile land for settlements. Beyond the rivers, the surrounding environment offered limited natural resources. Stone, timber, and metals were rare or absent locally. Timber for construction had to be sourced from distant areas, and metal ores were generally imported. This scarcity made building materials and tool production challenging. Mud and reeds, abundant in the marshy areas, became primary construction materials. The lack of defensive geographic features, such as mountains or forests, left communities exposed to flooding and other external threats. Faced with these geographic realities, early communities had to adapt to survive. Beginning around 4500 BCE, the increasing human populations began altering their environment through the construction of irrigation canals, dikes, and embankments. These water management systems aimed to regulate river flow, direct floodwaters to fields, and protect settlements. These projects required considerable labor and cooperation, often involving multiple villages working together. The introduction of irrigation marked a turning point. With controlled water supply, farmers could expand cultivated areas and produce more reliable harvests. This increase in agricultural productivity enabled the creation of surplus food. Surpluses allowed some individuals to focus on tasks other than farming, promoting specialization in crafts, trade, and administration. Managing irrigation infrastructure also meant regulating water access and land usage. Coordinated labor was necessary to build and maintain canals, ensuring equitable distribution and preventing disputes. These needs contributed to emerging social rules, norms, and leadership roles responsible for organizing collective action. The dependence on irrigation tied communities together, fostering intersettlement networks. Trade routes expanded as materials not found locally, such as obsidian for sharp tools, copper for weapons and ornaments, and timber for building, were exchanged across wider areas. These economic networks strengthened social ties beyond individual villages and facilitated the transfer of ideas and technologies. Geography's influence extended to settlement patterns. Early villages and proto-towns were often established on slightly elevated natural levees or ridges to minimize flood damage. Proximity to water was essential for agriculture and daily needs, but required careful site selection to balance risk and access. Archaeological evidence shows that settlement locations shifted over time in response to river course changes and flooding patterns. The scale and complexity of these early irrigation systems required sustained organization. Tasks such as canal excavation, embankment repairs, and seasonal water distribution could not be managed by small, isolated groups. Leadership roles began to formalize, with certain individuals or councils overseeing planning, labor mobilization, and dispute resolution. Though not kings or rulers in the later sense, these leaders were essential to maintaining cooperation. This emerging political organization was a system of coordinated human efforts to manage and modify the environment than solely as a cultural or ideological achievement. Archaeological investigations support this interpretation. Excavations of Ubaid period sites, dating from approximately 4500 BCE to 4000 BCE, reveal extensive canal networks connecting multiple settlements. The size and sophistication of these canals indicate advanced engineering knowledge and long-term planning. Associated artifacts show increased craft specialization and long-distance trade. As settlements expanded, public spaces and communal buildings emerged, reflecting the need for coordinated social activities. These structures likely served administrative and ritual functions, reinforcing social hierarchies and communal identity. The geographic constraints and opportunities continued to influence subsequent developments in Mesopotamian civilization. Water management remained central to economic and political life. Control over irrigation systems often determined social status and power distribution. Trade networks originating in this period expanded, linking Mesopotamia with regions as far as the Zagros Mountains and the Arabian Peninsula. These connections introduced new materials and ideas, accelerating technological and social change. In sum, the geography of southern Mesopotamia before and after 4500 BCE played a decisive role in shaping human society. The unpredictable rivers, scarce resources, and flat terrain forced communities to develop cooperative labor systems, shared infrastructure, and emergent leadership. Civilization emerged here as an adaptive response to environmental challenges. It was an infrastructure of canals, communal labor, and social organization designed to regulate the natural world and human activity. Understanding this context clarifies why Mesopotamia became a center of early civilization. The demands of geography made cooperation and hierarchy not merely beneficial but essential. This perspective highlights the practical origins of many features later associated with Sumerian civilization: administrative control, social stratification, labor specialization, and economic exchange. All arose from the need to manage water, land, and resources in a challenging environment. Segment 3. The Ubaid Foundations c. 4500 BCE around 4500 BCE. The southern Mesopotamian landscape began to reflect significant social and organizational transformations. This period, known as the Ubaid period, marks the formal emergence of what would become the Sumerian civilization's foundational structures. It is characterized by the establishment of permanent settlements, increasing interconnection between communities, and the beginnings of institutional coordination that would shape the region's future urban complexity. The Ubaid culture, named after the site of Tel al-Ubaid near modern-day Ur, is identified archaeologically through distinct material culture, including pottery styles, architecture, and settlement patterns. This culture extended across much of southern Mesopotamia, showing remarkable continuity and coherence in its characteristics. Permanent settlements during the Ubaid period differed significantly from earlier small, mobile farming communities. Villages grew larger, with populations often numbering in the low thousands. These communities featured more substantial buildings, including large rectangular houses made from mud bricks. Archaeological remains show evidence of carefully planned layouts, with streets, communal spaces, and public buildings suggesting increased social organization. One of the defining features of the Ubaid period is the emergence of central temples. These were not merely religious structures, but functioned as administrative and economic centers. Temples coordinated the storage and redistribution of food and resources, organized labor schedules for agricultural and infrastructural work, and managed surplus production. The temples were typically built on raised platforms or mounds, giving them physical prominence in the settlement. This architectural choice symbolized both their central role in community life and the growing complexity of social hierarchies. The temples served as landowners and employers, controlling large tracts of agricultural land and directing the labor of villagers. This institutional organization represents a shift from kin-based social structures to more formalized, hierarchical arrangements. While kinship remained important, the temple's administrative apparatus introduced new roles and divisions of labor. Specialists, such as craftsmen, traders, and scribes, began to emerge, supported by the surplus food and resources managed through temple coordination. Social differentiation became visible in the archaeological record. Variations in house size and quality suggest distinctions in wealth and status. The presence of luxury goods, such as finely made pottery and imported materials, indicates the existence of elite groups with access to resources beyond the immediate community. The Ubaid period also saw advances in technology and craft production. Pottery became more standardized and decorated, reflecting both functional improvements and aesthetic preferences. Craftspeople produced tools, textiles, and other goods with increasing specialization. These products were often distributed through networks linking different settlements. Trade networks expanded during this time. Materials such as obsidian, copper, and shells, which were not locally available, were obtained through long-distance exchange. These networks connected southern Mesopotamia with regions as far as the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian Plateau, and the Arabian Peninsula. The economic system of the Ubaid period was based largely on redistribution through temple institutions. Rather than direct wages, workers received rations of food, such as bread and beer, distributed by temple authorities. This system reinforced the central role of temples in organizing labor and maintaining social order. Despite the growing complexity, no evidence suggests the presence of kings or dynastic rulers during this period. Authority rested primarily with priest administrators who managed resources on behalf of the gods. Religious belief legitimized their role, linking the community's prosperity to maintaining divine favor through ritual and labor. Environmental management remained critical. Continued development of irrigation and flood control infrastructure supported expanding agricultural production. These projects required coordination and cooperation among multiple settlements, reinforcing intercommunity ties. Settlement patterns during the Ubaid period indicate a landscape of interconnected villages and small towns rather than large cities. Sites such as Eridu, considered one of the oldest settlements in the region, illustrate this pattern. Eridu's temple complex, built in successive phases, reflects the gradual accumulation of institutional power and architectural sophistication. The growth of settlements and institutional organization during the Ubaid period laid the groundwork for the emergence of the first true cities in Mesopotamia. The systems of resource management, labor coordination, and social differentiation developed in this era became the foundation upon which later urban centers were built. Understanding the Ubaid period is essential for grasping the origins of Mesopotamian civilization. It reveals how communities transitioned from small-scale, kin-based villages to more complex societies with centralized institutions and specialized roles. This transformation did not occur suddenly but unfolded over several centuries, marked by incremental innovations in social, economic, and technological domains. The Ubaid foundations illustrate the gradual and practical nature of early civilization building in southern Mesopotamia. Segment 4, From Villages to Cities, c. 4200 BCE to 4000 BCE. Between approximately 4200 BCE and 4000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia underwent a pivotal transformation. Settlements that had been primarily small villages began evolving into more complex urban centers. This transition from villages to cities marked a significant development in human social organization, economic activity, and spatial planning. Although monumental architecture, such as the large ziggurats and palaces of later periods, was not yet fully developed, the foundational elements of urban life were firmly established during this time. The environmental and geographic conditions of southern Mesopotamia continued to shape these changes. The flat, alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers offered fertile soil but required careful management of water through irrigation canals and flood control systems. The river's unpredictable flooding and shifting courses posed ongoing challenges. Settlements needed to be strategically located to maximize access to water while minimizing exposure to destructive floods. During this period, many settlements expanded significantly in size. Populations increased, with some sites estimated to have housed several thousand inhabitants. By 4000 BCE, this population growth resulted in increased density within settlements, leading to the development of planned layouts featuring streets, neighborhoods, and communal spaces. Archaeological excavations reveal that early urban settlements displayed a degree of spatial organization previously unseen in the region. Streets were often laid out in orderly grids or defined pathways, allowing for efficient movement within the community. Residential buildings were grouped in clusters, often centered around shared courtyards or communal facilities such as wells or storage areas. Central to these early cities were institutions that managed critical aspects of urban life. Temples, which had played a significant role during the preceding Ubaid period, expanded their functions to become central economic and administrative hubs. These temples managed agricultural surpluses, coordinated labor for maintaining irrigation infrastructure, and oversaw the distribution of goods. The role of the temple as a landowner and economic manager was crucial. It controlled extensive tracts of farmland worked by dependent laborers. Surplus foodstuffs were stored in granaries associated with temple complexes, enabling redistribution to workers, craftspeople, and administrators. This system supported craft specialization by freeing some individuals from subsistence agriculture, allowing them to focus on pottery, textile production, metalworking, and other specialized crafts. The growing complexity of economic activity and population density required new social mechanisms to maintain order and manage resources. Centralized authority figures associated with temple institutions began to emerge, overseeing the allocation of labor and goods, mediating disputes, and organizing communal projects. While the emergence of kingship as a formal institution had not yet occurred, leadership was exercised through priest administrators who combined religious and administrative authority. Their role was to maintain the balance between the community and the natural environment, particularly through the management of irrigation systems. Craft specialization became increasingly pronounced during this period. Workshops dedicated to pottery, weaving, tool-making, and metallurgy have been uncovered within early urban settlements. These workshops indicate a degree of production organization and skill development beyond what had been possible in smaller village settings. Trade networks expanded and intensified as cities became focal points of exchange. Raw materials and luxury goods, such as obsidian, lapis lazuli, and copper, were imported from distant regions. These materials were used to create tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects, contributing to social differentiation and status display. The archaeological record also indicates growing social stratification during this period. Variations in house size and construction quality, differences in burial goods, and the presence of luxury items suggest emerging social hierarchies. Elite individuals or groups likely controlled access to resources, labor, and institutional positions. Evidence of conflict and defensive measures appears in some settlements. Fortifications and defensive walls began to be constructed, suggesting concerns about security and territorial disputes. However, permanent standing armies or organized military institutions had not yet developed. Management of water resources remained central to urban life. Maintaining and expanding irrigation canals, embankments, and reservoirs required collective labor and coordination. Seasonal maintenance projects ensured reliable water supply for agriculture and domestic use. The daily life of inhabitants in these early cities involved the integration of labor, religious practice, and economic activity. Agricultural work, craft production, and trade formed the economic base, while temples provided organizational and ritual frameworks. Religious rituals reinforced social cohesion and legitimized the authority of priest administrators. The transition from village life to urban existence was not abrupt, but evolved over several generations. Multiple sectors, including economic, social, religious, and infrastructural, changed simultaneously. These developments laid the foundation for later innovations such as writing, kingship, and codified law. Understanding the emergence of cities in southern Mesopotamia during this period offers key insights into the origins of civilization. Early cities represented complex social systems capable of coordinating large populations, managing resources, and supporting specialized labor. These urban centers were not merely settlements with dense populations, but functioning systems with institutions designed to address the challenges posed by their environment and social complexity. The mechanisms developed during this period shaped the trajectory of Mesopotamian civilization and influenced subsequent urban developments across the ancient world. Between approximately 4500 BCE and 4000 BCE, in the context of the emerging Ubaid settlements of southern Mesopotamia, the relationship between religious belief and social organization took a distinct and foundational form. During this period, temples became central institutions that combined religious, economic, and administrative functions. This segment examines how temples operated as centers of institutional power and how the concept of divine ownership legitimized emerging social hierarchies. The geographic and environmental challenges of southern Mesopotamia required coordinated management of resources, labor, and production. Temples, often constructed on raised platforms within settlements, became focal points not only of worship, but also of economic activity and social regulation. Their physical prominence within the settlements symbolized their central role in daily life. Early temples were large, multi-roomed structures built primarily from mud brick. Their elevated platforms distinguished them architecturally and physically from surrounding buildings, emphasizing their importance. These platforms also functioned as administrative centers where temple officials coordinated activities and managed resources. The economic role of temples was significant. They acted as major landowners, controlling extensive agricultural lands worked by dependent laborers or tenant farmers. Surplus agricultural production, including barley, dates, and other crops, was collected and stored within temple granaries. This surplus supported temple personnel, craft specialists, laborers, and religious ceremonies. Temples functioned as redistribution centers. The accumulated goods were allocated according to social and economic roles within the community. Workers received rations of food, beer, and raw materials needed for their crafts. Redistribution helped maintain social stability by ensuring that laborers were compensated and motivated to contribute to communal projects. This system linked economic production closely with religious practice. The belief that the gods owned the land and its produce underpinned the organization of labor and resource management. Humans, acting as caretakers, worked to maintain divine order by performing agricultural labor, crafting goods, and offering rituals. Religious rituals were integral to temple life. Offerings, ceremonies, and festivals reinforced the authority of the temple institution and its connection to the divine. These rituals served to legitimize the social order and the power of priest administrators overseeing temple affairs. The priests and administrators held dual roles as religious leaders and economic managers. Their authority derived from their position as intermediaries between the gods and the community. They coordinated labor, managed surplus, settled disputes, and organized large-scale projects such as irrigation maintenance and construction. Leadership during this period was not yet centralized in kingship, but rested with these priest administrators. Their power was institutional rather than personal, embedded in the temple as an enduring organization. This distinction is important as it differentiates early Mesopotamian governance from later dynastic rule. The physical layout of settlements reflects the temple's centrality. Temples occupied prominent positions, often at the highest point or central area of the town. Surrounding residential neighborhoods and workshops were organized around this core, highlighting the temple's role as a hub of social and economic life. Artifacts recovered from archaeological sites provide evidence of the temple's administrative functions. Seals, tokens, and early accounting tools suggest systems for recording resource inventories, labor contributions, and distribution. These administrative practices foreshadow the later development of writing and bureaucracy. The symbolic meaning of temple platforms reinforced social cohesion. The raised structure physically elevated the temple above ordinary buildings, signaling its special status. This architectural feature represented the separation between the divine realm and the everyday world, anchoring the community's spiritual and temporal order. The integration of religion and administration helped maintain stability within increasingly complex settlements. By linking economic management with religious belief, temples provided a framework for organizing labor, controlling resources, and legitimizing social roles. The concept of divine ownership also influenced land tenure and property rights. Land was considered the property of the gods, with humans acting as stewards. This belief system structured relationships between individuals, institutions, and the environment. Trade and craft production were likewise connected to temple institutions. Specialized craftspeople often worked under temple supervision, producing goods for ritual use, trade, and daily consumption. This arrangement facilitated centralized control over economic activities and resource allocation. Social differentiation was evident in access to temple services and participation in rituals. While the general populace contributed labor and received rations, certain individuals held privileged positions within temple administration, reflecting emerging social hierarchies. The temple economy was supported by a labor force organized through various mechanisms. Seasonal agricultural work, irrigation maintenance, craft production, and religious service required coordinated schedules and task allocation. The temple's administrative apparatus managed these activities to ensure efficiency and productivity. Conflicts related to land and water resources existed but were managed within this institutional framework. The temple played a role in mediating disputes and maintaining communal order through its authority and religious legitimacy. This model of governance based on temples and divine authority persisted into later periods, forming the foundation for the rise of city-states and kingship in Mesopotamia. Understanding the temple's multifaceted role during the Ubaid period provides essential insight into the origins of institutional power and state formation. In summary, between 4500 BCE and 4000 BCE, temples in southern Mesopotamia functioned as central institutions that combined religious, economic, and administrative power. Their role extended beyond worship to encompass resource management, labor coordination, and social regulation. The belief in divine ownership legitimized this authority, anchoring emerging social hierarchies within a framework that connected the community to the gods and the environment. Around 4000 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, this was a pivotal moment. Communities were growing, agriculture was booming, and trade networks were stretching further than ever before. With all this complexity, a huge question arose. How do you manage everything without a writing system? How do you track resources, organize labor, and handle economic exchanges when you can't just write it all down? The answer is fascinating. Long before the invention of cuneiform script, early Sumerian societies developed ingenious proto-administrative tools. It's crucial to understand these systems because they weren't just simple counting aids. They were the intellectual bedrock upon which writing itself would later be built. This isn't a story about literacy, but about the clever systems that made complex society possible in the first place. The stage was set during the earlier Ubaid period. The demands of large-scale irrigation agriculture meant that people had to coordinate their efforts. Who works when? How is water distributed fairly? The temples, acting as early community centers, began to manage surplus food and organize labor. To do this effectively, they needed a reliable way to keep track of goods, ownership, and obligations. This need gave rise to one of the earliest and most brilliant administrative tools, small clay tokens. These weren't just random pebbles. They were carefully crafted in various shapes: spheres, cones, cylinders, and discs. Each shape had a specific meaning. A cone-shaped token, for instance, might represent a standard measure of grain, while a sphere could stand for a head of livestock. Think of it as a physical, three-dimensional spreadsheet. When a transaction took place, the corresponding tokens would be exchanged. To keep records secure, these tokens were often placed inside a hollow clay ball called a bulla. The bulla would then be sealed shut. This was a game changer. An official could now verify a shipment of grain, a contribution of labor, or a contractual agreement by simply breaking open the bulla and counting the tokens inside. It was a tangible, verifiable record. The use of these tokens represents a massive intellectual leap. It's a move from relying on fallible human memory to using abstract, physical symbols to manage economic data. This innovation didn't just make things more efficient. It introduced a new level of accountability and allowed for far more complex social and economic interactions. Alongside tokens, another critical tool came into play: the seal. These were small, intricately carved objects, usually made of stone, that were unique to an individual or an institution. When pressed into wet clay, a seal left a distinct impression, like a signature. Seals were used to authenticate documents, mark ownership on jars of goods, or secure storeroom doors. A seal impression wasn't just a mark, it was a symbol of identity and authority. It was a way to say, "I approve this transaction," or "this property belongs to the temple." The seal system introduced the fundamental concepts of identity, validation, and security, which are absolutely essential for any complex society to function. Over time, these seals also became powerful symbols of status and institutional control, but the innovation didn't stop there. The early Sumerians also began using simple pictographic markings on clay tablets or containers. These weren't words, they were more like icons or tallies. A simple drawing of a jar next to a series of lines might indicate the number of jars of oil in a delivery. While not a true writing system, these symbolic markings served as crucial memory aids and administrative records. You can see a clear progression here, from simple tokens representing goods to sealed containers for security to early pictographs on tablets. Each step was a refinement and improvement in the ability to record, organize, and communicate increasingly complex information. This gradual development shows the intellectual journey that ultimately culminated in the invention of writing. And this administration was about much more than just counting sheep and barley. These tools were used to manage the very fabric of society. Officials could schedule work crews for massive public projects, like maintaining irrigation canals or building temples. They allocated rations to workers and meticulously tracked each person's contribution to the community. This level of organization would have been impossible without these systems. Trade also flourished. When sending goods over long distances, you need a reliable way to account for everything. Tokens, seals, and markings provided that reliability. They created a system of record keeping that helped ensure goods shipped were the same goods received, minimizing disputes and building trust between trading partners. It's important to remember that these administrative practices were not for personal diaries or individual use. They were communal and institutional, born from the collective needs of a growing society. The systems were managed by temple priests and early officials tasked with coordinating the resources and labor of the entire community. The absence of writing didn't mean a lack of organization. It meant that organization took a different, very tangible form. Archaeological sites like Uruk in southern Iraq have yielded vast quantities of these artifacts: countless clay tokens, bulla, seals, and early marked tablets. This evidence confirms just how widespread and essential these proto-administrative systems were. They were the engine that enabled the efficient management of labor, food surplus, and trade, directly contributing to the rise of the world's first cities and complex institutions. The eventual invention of writing, which added phonetic sounds to the symbols, was revolutionary. It allowed for the recording of laws, literature, and history. But we must never forget that its roots lie in these humble, practical tools. They were developed not by scholars in a library, but by administrators and managers facing the real-world challenges of a rapidly evolving civilization. This period shows us how human societies brilliantly adapt, developing sophisticated symbolic thought to solve very practical problems. So, in summary, long before the first words were ever written, the people of Mesopotamia were already masters of data management. Using an elegant system of clay tokens, seals, and pictographs, they built and managed a complex world. These tools weren't just precursors to writing. They were a monumental achievement in their own right, a testament to human ingenuity and the foundation of civilization itself. Segment 7. Economy, Trade, and Daily Life 4500 BCE to 4000 BCE. Between 4500 BCE and 4000 BCE. Southern Mesopotamia saw the further development of economic systems that supported the growing complexity of its communities. The daily lives of most inhabitants revolved around agricultural production, craft specialization, and increasingly extensive trade networks. This segment examines the economic foundations of early Sumerian civilization, highlighting the mechanisms that structured daily work, exchange, and social organization during this formative period. Agriculture formed the economic base of these societies. Farmers primarily cultivated barley, which served as a staple grain due to its adaptability to the local climate and soil. Date palms also played a significant role, providing both food and raw materials such as fiber for weaving. Livestock, including sheep, goats, and cattle, were raised for meat, milk, wool, and hides. The combination of crop cultivation and animal husbandry created a diverse subsistence economy capable of supporting larger populations. Agricultural production depended heavily on irrigation. Seasonal flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers deposited nutrient-rich silt, but the unpredictability of these floods required communities to manage water carefully. Canals, dikes, and reservoirs were constructed and maintained to direct water flow, enabling cultivation even during dry periods. This system demanded coordinated labor efforts and oversight, often organized through temple administration. Most farmers worked as part of small household units, combining family labor with communal irrigation tasks. These households produced food primarily for local consumption, but also contributed surplus to temple storage facilities. Temples functioned as economic centers, collecting and redistributing resources to support specialized laborers, religious personnel, and large-scale projects. The temple economy was not based on wage labor as understood today. Instead, distribution occurred through rations, regular allocations of food and goods such as bread, beer, and wool. These rations compensated laborers for their work on communal tasks like irrigation maintenance, construction, and craft production. The system reinforced social cohesion by linking labor contributions to material support. Craft specialization emerged alongside agriculture. Pottery production was one of the earliest crafts to develop significant complexity. Potters created vessels for storage, cooking, and transport, employing techniques such as wheel throwing and kiln firing. Pottery styles varied regionally and evolved over time, reflecting cultural preferences and technological advancements. Textile production was another crucial craft. Wool from sheep was spun into thread and woven into cloth, supplying clothing and other goods. Textile workers operated within temple workshops or household settings, producing items both for local use and for trade. Metalworking began in this period as well, though on a smaller scale compared to later centuries. Copper was the primary metal used, often obtained through trade with neighboring regions. Craftsmen fashioned tools, weapons, and ornamental objects, contributing to the diversification of material culture. Trade networks extended beyond local exchanges, connecting southern Mesopotamia to distant areas. Archaeological findings reveal the importation of raw materials such as obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and copper from the Arabian Peninsula. These materials were highly valued for their utility and rarity. Trade was facilitated by river transport and overland routes. Boats navigating the Tigris and Euphrates carried goods downstream to urban centers and upstream to agricultural settlements. Overland caravans transported materials across deserts and mountain passes, linking Mesopotamian communities to wider regional economies. Marketplaces likely existed within settlements, providing venues for the exchange of goods and services. However, much trade and redistribution occurred under the oversight of temple administrators who regulated economic activity to ensure resource allocation aligned with communal needs. Daily life in early Sumerian communities was structured around work, water management, and social obligation. Labor was organized into cycles that balanced individual household production with collective tasks. Seasonal changes influenced agricultural activities, with planting and harvesting coordinated to optimize yields. Water remained a central concern. Managing irrigation infrastructure required constant maintenance, with laborers clearing canals, repairing dikes, and monitoring water levels. These efforts were essential to prevent flooding or drought, both of which could have severe consequences for food production. Religious practices intertwined with economic life. Temples served not only as places of worship, but also as centers of economic management. Rituals often accompanied agricultural and craft activities, reflecting the belief that divine forces influenced natural processes and social order. Social differentiation became more apparent during this period. While most people engaged in subsistence activities, a growing number of specialists such as craftsmen, traders, and administrators emerged. These individuals often lived in proximity to temples or urban centers, where their skills supported broader community functions. Women likely played significant roles in household production and crafts, particularly textile work and food preparation. Although direct evidence is limited, archaeological findings suggest gendered divisions of labor within early Mesopotamian society. Children contributed to daily work according to age and capability, learning skills through participation in family and communal tasks. Education at this stage was primarily informal, transmitted through practice rather than formal instruction. Housing varied from simple mud brick structures for farmers to larger, more complex buildings in urban settlements. Architectural remains indicate that community planning incorporated streets, public spaces, and storage facilities, reflecting growing social organization. The diet of early Sumerians was based on cultivated grains, supplemented by fruits, vegetables, and animal products. Bread and beer were dietary staples, often produced and consumed communally. These items also held ritual significance, linking nourishment to spiritual life. Health and sanitation practices are less well documented, but likely included measures to manage waste and ensure access to clean water. The organization of settlements suggests awareness of hygiene as a factor in community well-being. In summary, between 4500 BCE and 4000 BCE, the economy and daily life of southern Mesopotamian communities were shaped by integrated systems of agriculture, craft specialization, and trade. Temples acted as economic hubs, coordinating labor and resource distribution through rationing and administration. The development of trade networks connected these early societies to wider regions, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas. Daily life centered on work tied to land, water, and communal responsibility, laying the foundation for the complex civilization that would follow. Between 4500 BCE and 4000 BCE, the societies of southern Mesopotamia were characterized by leadership structures distinct from the dynastic kingships known from later periods. This segment explores the nature of authority during this formative era, emphasizing the role of priest administrators and institutional power prior to the emergence of monarchic rule. At this stage, no individual held sovereign power as a king. Instead, authority rested with priest administrators operating within temple complexes. These individuals managed the allocation of resources, supervised labor, and coordinated religious activities for the community. Their legitimacy stemmed from their connection to the temple, regarded as the earthly residence of the gods. Temples served as both religious and political centers. They owned significant land holdings, controlled stored surplus, and directed large-scale projects such as irrigation maintenance and public construction. Priest administrators exercised power through their official roles within the temple hierarchy rather than personal or hereditary claim. The authority they wielded was institutional, embedded within community frameworks and religious beliefs. Leadership was exercised through formal responsibilities linked to temple administration. The office, rather than the individual, constituted the source of power. Management of water resources was a central function of authority. The coordination of canal construction, maintenance, and seasonal irrigation required organized labor. Priest administrators scheduled work crews and allocated food rations to sustain workers, linking economic activity to religious governance. Control over surplus production was another key element. Temples collected and stored grain, livestock, and crafted goods. Administrators tracked these resources using early record-keeping systems, ensuring redistribution supported communal needs and ongoing projects. Conflict over land and water was present but resolved through localized negotiation rather than centralized enforcement. No standing military or formalized armies existed. Groups mobilized temporarily for defense or dispute resolution, reflecting decentralized political structures. The scope of leadership varied with settlement size. Larger centers such as Eridu and early Uruk developed more complex bureaucracies with multiple levels of administrative roles. Smaller villages retained simpler leadership forms, often based on councils or assemblies. Decision-making involved collective bodies, including elders, priests, and specialists. These assemblies deliberated on communal matters, resource management, and conflict resolution, fostering shared governance. Social stratification was evident but not rigid. Differentiation occurred between religious officials, skilled laborers, and agricultural workers. Movement between roles was possible, dependent on skill and circumstance rather than fixed status. Priest administrators maintained authority in part by regulating labor and surplus distribution. The ration system compensated workers and reinforced social cohesion. This mechanism provided stability and encouraged participation without coercion. Religious ideology legitimized authority, the temple represented divine presence, and administrators acted as caretakers of sacred order. Rituals and offerings underscored this relationship, integrating political and religious power. While kingship was absent, these communities exhibited organized, institutional governance suited to their social and environmental context. The temple's central role structured political, economic, and religious life. Archaeological evidence supports this model. Administrative buildings, storage facilities, and seal impressions attest to formalized leadership and record-keeping practices. These material remains demonstrate the complexity of early institutional authority. This system of authority without kings laid the foundation for future political developments. The established administrative practices and social organization would evolve into centralized monarchies in subsequent centuries. In summary, from 4500 BCE to 4000 BCE, authority in southern Mesopotamian settlements was exercised by priest administrators connected to temples. Leadership was collective, institutional, and integrated with religious and economic functions. Conflict management was localized, social hierarchy was emerging but flexible, and military institutions were absent. This form of governance provided the coordination necessary for the development of early civilization. By 4000 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian region had undergone significant transformations. The communities that once consisted of loosely connected farming settlements had evolved into interconnected, institutionally organized societies. This segment examines how the combination of social, economic, religious, and administrative developments created a complex system of civilization that had become self-sustaining and irreversible. One of the key features of this period was the emergence of organized labor. Coordinating large-scale irrigation systems, food storage, and construction projects required sustained collective effort. Authority figures, mainly temple administrators, directed workforces by scheduling labor and allocating food rations. This management ensured that crucial infrastructure was maintained, enabling agricultural productivity to support growing populations. Surplus storage became central to these societies. The ability to store grain and other resources provided a buffer against environmental uncertainties such as drought or flooding. This surplus was carefully managed within temple complexes, which functioned as both religious and economic centers. The stored goods could be redistributed during times of need, supporting community stability. Institutionalized religion played a critical role in maintaining social cohesion. Temples were considered the physical dwellings of gods, and rituals reinforced the divine legitimacy of administrative leaders. Religious festivals and ceremonies punctuated the agricultural calendar, coordinating social activity and reinforcing communal identity. Long-distance trade networks expanded during this period. Goods such as obsidian from Anatolia, copper from the Oman Peninsula, and other luxury items traveled significant distances to reach southern Mesopotamian settlements. Trade introduced new materials and ideas, further integrating communities and fostering economic complexity. Social hierarchy was more clearly defined by 4000 BCE. Distinct social classes had emerged, including priest administrators, skilled artisans, laborers, and farmers. These roles were specialized and interconnected, contributing to the overall functionality of the society. Although social mobility was limited compared to later periods, these divisions structured daily life and labor organization. Writing had not yet been invented, but early record-keeping systems using clay tokens and seals laid the groundwork for future developments. These administrative tools enabled accurate tracking of goods, labor, and obligations, which was essential for managing surplus and coordinating large populations. The combined effect of these systems was a society that depended less on immediate natural conditions and more on human-managed infrastructure and organization. Survival and success were tied to effective administration, cooperation, and resource management. This integration of labor, surplus storage, religion, trade, and social hierarchy created a feedback loop. Each element supported and reinforced the others, making the overall system resilient and adaptive. Once these systems were in place, the trajectory toward increasingly complex civilization was effectively irreversible. Communities could no longer function as isolated farming groups, but were interconnected through institutional networks. The importance of administration cannot be overstated. The management of water, food, labor, and resources required new forms of authority and communication. These administrative innovations represented a major shift in human social organization. The irreversible nature of civilization also meant that certain challenges emerged. Conflicts over resources became more frequent and complex. Disputes required formal mechanisms for resolution, leading to the development of legal and political structures. Furthermore, the concentration of surplus and authority in temples increased social stratification. Power became more centralized, setting the stage for future political changes, including the emergence of kingship. However, these developments did not occur uniformly. Variations in environment, population, and local traditions meant that some communities advanced more rapidly while others maintained simpler social structures. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Eridu, Uruk, and others illustrates the scale of change. Large temple complexes, storage facilities, and administrative artifacts reflect the complexity and permanence of these systems. By 4000 BCE, southern Mesopotamian civilization had moved beyond earlier stages of social organization. The combination of institutional religion, economic management, social hierarchy, and interregional trade formed a system capable of supporting large urban populations. This system laid the foundation for subsequent developments in writing, law, kingship, and empire, which would transform human history further. The significance of this period lies in its establishment of civilization as a permanent human condition. The tools, structures, and relationships created during this time were adopted and adapted by future societies. In summary, by 4000 BCE, southern Mesopotamian societies had achieved an integrated, self-sustaining system of civilization. Organized labor, surplus storage, institutional religion, trade networks, and social hierarchy combined to create a resilient social order. Civilization had become irreversible, setting humanity on a new path. By 4000 BCE, the foundations of what would become one of the world's earliest civilizations were firmly established in southern Mesopotamia. The developments that took place by this time set the stage for future advancements, but should be understood as capacities rather than completed achievements. This segment focuses on the institutional, social, and economic structures that emerged during the Ubaid period and clarifies that key innovations such as writing, kingship, formal law, and imperial expansion would follow in later periods. At this juncture, southern Mesopotamia was no longer characterized by isolated farming villages. Instead, it was defined by a network of interconnected settlements bound together through shared religious practices, economic interdependence, and coordinated administrative systems. These networks allowed communities to regulate labor, manage surplus resources, and organize collective projects essential to their survival and growth. The temple complex functioned as the central institution. These were not merely places of worship. They were hubs of economic activity and administrative coordination. Priests and temple administrators oversaw irrigation systems, stored and redistributed food supplies, directed labor, and managed ritual events. This dual function ensured that religious and economic life were deeply intertwined, facilitating social cohesion and institutional stability. Surplus production and storage had become routine and reliable. Agricultural surpluses were stored in temple granaries and other communal facilities, providing a buffer against the uncertainties of the environment, such as floods or droughts. The control of these reserves helped to stabilize food availability, supporting larger populations and fostering demographic growth. Trade networks connected southern Mesopotamia with distant regions. Through these exchanges, materials such as copper from the Oman Peninsula, obsidian from Anatolia, and semi-precious stones from the Iranian plateau entered the region. This movement of goods introduced new raw materials and influenced cultural and technological development. Trade contributed to economic complexity and facilitated interactions between diverse communities. Social differentiation was pronounced by 4000 BCE. The society consisted of various roles, including religious officials, skilled artisans, farmers, and laborers. These roles were specialized and institutionalized. Social status was linked to occupation and institutional affiliation, with some limited social mobility possible within these parameters. The emerging hierarchy structured both daily life and resource distribution. Despite these structural developments, certain institutions central to later Sumerian civilization had not yet emerged. Writing as a fully developed system of literacy was not in use. Instead, proto-writing techniques involving clay tokens and seal impressions served administrative purposes, tracking goods and obligations. These systems would lay the groundwork for the later invention of cuneiform script. Political authority was primarily institutional rather than personal. Leadership roles were occupied by priest administrators connected to temple complexes. Formal kingship with hereditary rulers and standing armies had not yet developed. Conflicts and disputes over resources were typically localized and resolved through community mechanisms rather than centralized coercion. Military organization remained limited and irregular. While conflicts may have occurred, there were no permanent armies or professional soldiers. Defense was managed locally by the communities themselves, without the emergence of state-controlled military power. These limitations illustrate that the period ending at 4000 BCE represents a formative stage of civilization rather than its culmination. The institutional capacities in place were crucial but not yet fully developed into the political and cultural structures that would characterize later Mesopotamian city-states and empires. The significance of this era lies in the establishment of foundational capacities rather than in grand achievements or monumental architecture. The tools, structures, and organizational forms present in this period created the conditions necessary for the innovations that followed. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Eridu and Uruk reveals extensive temple complexes, storage facilities, and administrative artifacts. These findings demonstrate the scale and complexity of communal organization and resource management at this early stage. The conclusion of this period marks a point of transition. The social, economic, and religious systems that had developed would provide the platform for future technological, political, and cultural advances. Surplus management, labor coordination, and religious institutionalization enabled societies to sustain larger populations and more complex economies. These capacities established the basis for innovations in record-keeping, legal codification, centralized authority, and territorial expansion. This period's legacy is not one of completion, but of ongoing potential. The systems developed allowed for adaptation and growth, setting the direction of human civilization in Mesopotamia. The intertwining of religious and economic authority within temples ensured institutional continuity and provided a framework for managing increasingly complex social relationships. While monumental architecture and formal political institutions such as kingship would emerge later, the foundations laid by 4000 BCE were essential precursors. This stage illustrates that civilization is a process rather than a singular event. The capacities developed during the Ubaid period enabled the gradual emergence of the urban, literate, and bureaucratic societies of later millennia. In summary, by 4000 BCE, southern Mesopotamian communities had created a system of interrelated institutions managing labor, surplus, religion, and trade. This system formed the structural foundation of early civilization. The period represents the beginning of a sustained trajectory toward complexity and centralization rather than a fixed endpoint. Civilization, in this sense, was established as a durable and evolving condition that would shape the region's history for centuries to come.